Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So today we have a fairly deep topic regarding the nature of reality and how we figure out how to make better ethical decisions in our lives. So we had a good conversation last week with some fellow churches at World Religion Day, which I thought was a really good event, a really good opportunity to learn from others, to better understand where they come from and better help ground ourselves in what we use as a philosophic system to then refine our decision-making. So one of the conversations that we had was regarding the nature of truth, and this is a capital T truth. One gentleman that I spoke with, he is in the pursuit of truth, and particularly in the fashion of Christianity and as a self-described Christian apologetic. And in having the conversation, I realized that to me, and the way I see using humanism as a framework, that truth, the capital T truth, what is, objectively, if you want to call it that, isn't actually that important. And that seems like a weird thing to say, that the truth isn't important or that facts or reality aren't important. But I'll try and build for you a framework the way I understand it, and then hopefully that all makes sense. But I think if we discount truth, it's actually easier for us to make decisions that are reasonable and rational and beneficial for ourselves, our communities, and humanity. So let me break it down based on what I understand. So what does it mean for something to be true or right or good? Right? A lot of times in the traditional fashion, we define those things in the sense of some higher power has defined what is true or right or good. And we either adhere to those things or we don't. And based on our understanding and our adherence to that, we are either good or not. But how do you prove those things? How do you prove right or wrong, true or not true? Right? So from the humanistic perspective, the only thing we know for certainty is that I exist, and that's for each of us individually. I exist. I don't know that everyone else exists. Now, I'm not a solipsist. I don't believe that I am the only one that exists. I think it is reasonable to assume that I exist, and therefore it's likely that other I's exist, especially if we consider things like evolution and biology, right? It's reasonable that other people have the same functions that I do. I can't prove it, though. And this is where we get to the point where I don't think it's necessary to try. I don't think I need to try and prove categorically and absolutely and objectively that you all exist. As long as I accept it functionally, that's all that really matters in terms of everyday life. So why does this matter? Why does this concept matter? So if we go back to, I think it was our second service, we talked about the development of the individual to developing morality, and then how we derive ethics from that, and then how we come to agree upon law, right? So morality, the way we've sort of defined it is an individual's understanding of right and wrong, right? So they realize that keeping themselves alive is good, and that from their perspective, going out and finding resources, regardless of what it is that they do to get them, is a good thing, right? So, but then we run into other people, right, in our society. And so if we are gathering resources for ourselves, which is a good, but we take them from other people, which they would perceive as a bad, then we come into conflict. So once we have individuals that come together and they have different codes of morality or codes of morality that might conflict with each other, we have to derive ethics, right? We have to figure out in which ways can we mutually agree upon that allow for the functioning of society, right? So that's ethics. And then we codify those things, we write them down so that everybody can know and understand them, so there's a basis that we can all operate from, and that's how we get law. Now, it's not always that it has necessarily progressed in that specific and logical fashion where we all sat down and said, well, what would be best for society? But that's sort of the different levels of having an understanding. So it's a quick recap on our thoughts on morality, ethics, and law. And so the way we look at humans, we have what we would call a decision-making stack. We have layers of decision-making processes that build on each other to become more complex. So we've got sort of the reptilian brain, That's your reflex, right? You get hit on the knee, your leg kicks out. Something's coming at you, you're going to fight it or run away. Then on top of that, you've got your lazy brain, right? So this is your evolutionary brain that basically says, all right, we need to conserve energy as a guiding principle. We want to gather resources, eat as much as we can, have abundance, right? So that's your lazy brain. So it's not your reptilian brain, the little piece, it's the one that's just ahead of it, right? Then you've got your risk management brain, right? That's your threat detection. It's a little bit higher level, but it still operates heuristically, right? We chunk things into categories, so it makes it easier to detect threats or find resources. But it's not necessarily a really, really long-term brain or function of your brain, part of that stack. It's only until you get to the last one, what I would call the ascendant or transcendent human brain, that frontal cortex, that allows you to do really long-term forecasting. Consider things like global warming or the climate or our impacts on other species, right? Those things take factoring in a ton of information and really sitting down and not doing things in the moment like, oh, is this good or bad? Because usually if you're doing things in the moment, your brain says, well, I want to eat, so whatever it takes to eat, that's what we're going to do. So it takes that long-term forecasting to be able to make the decisions that might be counter to what the lazy brain or the reptilian brain would do in pursuit of some higher level goal. So then, there are really two different ways once we get to the more rational brain, and it's the difference between the threat detection brain, the risk management brain, and the ascendant human brain, so that frontal cortex. And so like I mentioned, humans are really fond of putting things into categories, right? We like labeling things and making things mutually exclusive. And we do that because it's an evolutionary benefit, right? It allows us to make rapid decisions on threats and rewards. All right, that thing has teeth. I'm going to put it in the teeth category, and anything in the teeth category I'm going to stay away from, right? That's a categorization, that's a heuristic. So we have to consider that we've been programmed to deal with things in that way. But that also leads to that idea that we want to categorize or chunk things also leads to things like bias and racism and profiling, right? So that's the same function of the human brain, that we're categorizing things to detect threats and figure out what we're going to do on a given basis. But it's using a process that it wasn't necessarily designed for in the complex human society we have today. So we need another layer on top of that. We need a layer that allows us to second guess ourselves and use a sort of feedback loop to interject new information and refine how we make those decisions. So the way that I would contrast these is, for example, a categorical thinking or a heuristic thinking would be like the 10 Commandments. They are commandments. They are always true in all cases, right? So thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill sometimes. Now, in some translations, it actually says thou shalt not murder, but about half of them say thou shalt not kill. Well, I can think of a lot of examples where it makes sense to kill. Protecting your family, putting down basically, someone who's a threat to you, right? Because that goes back to that individual morality that we have the right to self-defense. So that means that we have these categoricals that should be true in all cases, but oftentimes there are examples or circumstances where we find them to not be true. And that's where we have cognitive dissonance. Because if we're operating on a rule set that we either ourselves or someone else has given us, and we find them to not be true, if we don't have a system to then figure out what to do in those circumstances, we're at a loss. And we're either at a loss to make a rapid decision to advance our selves, our community, or humanity, or we stick with the commandment, the category, to the detriment of the decision. So this is where we come to the second mode of thinking, the systemic thinking, right? So it's not set rules. There are guidelines or values that are weighted that we use to make the best decision possible, given a certain set of data. So to resolve that cognitive dissonance, we've got to be able to rethink, take in new data, and have an approach where we can consider something new. Now that leads to a situation where using the categories or using the heuristics are much easier, right? We match it up with a checklist. If it matches the checklist, then great. If it doesn't match the checklist, we either don't do it or then we have a harder decision to make. But it's easier to do. And we do this for ourselves. Even if you have a really good system to consider different things, we make rules that are generally true, right? We try not to eat sugar, or we try to be nice to our family and be nice to others. So we've come up with rules even for ourselves. They may not be categoricals where we think to ourselves, this is true in all cases, but they're generally true, right? So rules of thumb, if you want to call it that. But when you're making decisions with, when we're using that longer-term forecasting brain, it's a lot harder. And there's a lot more responsibility with it. Because what you have to do is consider all of the factors, right? As we grow and expand our minds to include ourselves, our community, and humanity, we then have to think in all of our decisions, well, how does this affect humanity? Right? And that could get to the point where you're at decision paralysis and you never decide to do anything because you're so afraid of what the consequences could be. Right? We're not advocating that. At some point, we have to make a decision and move forward. But I wanted to contrast those two ways of thinking, the categorical or rules-based or an outsourced system that someone has just given you that checklist versus an internalized system that we have thought through trying to make the best value-based decision that we can. And then the challenge with one is that we end up with cognitive dissonance more often than not because we're trying to match up rules with reality when reality doesn't fit neatly within rules or categories. Or we have the challenge of making really complex decisions based on limited data. And so I wanted to point out that it's okay. It's okay for us to make decisions based on limited data. Because otherwise we do nothing, right? And nothing is also a choice, and generally it's not a good one. So moving on to what is true. Now the reason I brought that up in the beginning of questioning truth or questioning reality is because if we can't prove anything, then how can you say that something is categorically true or false, or categorically right or wrong, or categorically good or bad? Now, there may be something out there that is categorically one of those things, but it's impossible for us to know. So to me, it's like the argument for and against God. To assert that God absolutely exists or assert that God absolutely does not exist are both relying on faith. And so I take neither position. Now, personally, I operate as if there is no interventionist God dictating what things happen in life. Because from my viewpoint, to take that approach would be to give up free will. And society, the way we've structured it, is essentially built on free will. I mean, what's the point of law if people are going to do what they're destined to do anyway? So to me, we have decisions to make, and that means we have the free will to make it. We can have a longer conversation about free will in the future. But if that's true, and that's an assumption, right? So if it's the case that we have free will, then it is less important if things are objectively true or not. And the way that we have derived truth using the humanist system is, again, I think, therefore I am. That makes sense, right? We all think the thought I feel, I am cold, I am warm, I am hungry. And from there, we can say, well, I assume that other people are as well. I perceive them. They seem to perceive me. And we can kind of triangulate reality, right? We all perceive that we are all in this room. Probably means that, based on the best data we have available, that we all exist, and we're all in this room together, and we're all listening to me talk. And that's okay. That's good enough, right? In the intelligence world, in military intelligence, there's this concept of levels of confidence. Intelligence professionals never say this is true, or this is here, or that is the way that these things are constructed. They say, this is the data we have with a high, medium, or low level of confidence. So the farther you get away from I, and the farther you get away from things that are perceivable, the less confidence you have, but that doesn't mean that you simply discard it, right? I'm not as confident about quarks in string theory as I am that we are in this room together. Because one, I don't fully understand string theory and quarks. And two, I can't see and observe them. So to me, they are a little bit less real. Now, it doesn't mean I discount them, because it's a decent theory that may help us better understand the universe. Maybe not me in particular, but other people in the world. And out of that, they may derive something that makes something more simpler to explain or understand. I saw an Einstein quote the other day that if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. So I'm trying to do my best to explain this simply. So we'll see how well I understand it. And so to me, it's more about the high degree of certainty and the consistency of the story than it is truth, the capital T truth, or what is real. If it is consistent to all of us that we're all here in this room and that we should interact with each other in a way where we treat each other fairly and with respect and without violence, well, if that story is consistent, then it's a useful thing to adopt as a framework. And so we all have to make decisions about the usefulness of data, right? And we do that including religion and faith. Because even within a religion, you have to choose whether you're going to follow the rules or not follow the rules. You're going to choose whether or not you believe in the system or you don't believe in the system. So even if you do choose to outsource or use the categorical method for decision-making, you've still made that choice internally within the I, within the concept of yourself. Now, you might not think it, but it is the case. Because if you don't make the decision, then that means you decided nothing, right? And nothing happens. So one of the things that we were having a discussion about in talking about this topic was the idea that other philosophies do want to prescribe the things that are right and wrong. And I don't know for certain that this is why they do it, but I have a hunch that there's a sense among the leadership of those philosophies that people cannot understand the complexity of the world, and it's difficult for them to have the responsibility to make decisions. Now, in the tradition of humanism, I don't think that's the case. I think people are responsible to different levels of making those decisions based on the complexity of the world that they live in. And I also think it's imperative that we're educating people to try and make better decisions to incorporate more of the world, right? So if we talk about explaining things to our children, so I have my daughter here today with us in the audience. She's 5. And when I explain things to her, I might use a simplified method to explain why we're nice to people, right? We're nice to people because we would want people to be nice to us. And if we don't treat them fairly, then they're not incentivized to treat us fairly, right? That's a very simplified version of the golden rule, which is itself fairly simple. Now, it gets more complex in the real world. There are times when meanness or violence is necessary. But if we start with kind of a basic version and we grow to include exceptions, then that's okay. But we don't start from the premise that this rule is always true. We just give them a guideline and help them understand that. And kids are very good at finding holes in logic, especially despite how young they are. And it's good for them to do that because then we're teaching them to use their critical thinking from the beginning instead of telling them, no, you have to do this all the time no matter what. So I think that's an important difference in mindset with our humanist church than maybe other churches out there. It's not about following orders. It's about making the best decision you can with the information you have and considering not just yourself, but your community and humanity. So Matt had a really good story about how we can think about different levels of complexity. So it's a sort of a simplified story. If you go to a restaurant and you order scrambled eggs, and you don't know much about cooking or scrambled eggs, you think, well, they crack some eggs, they move them around, they get cooked, and they are delivered to my plate. But if you asked a chef who's maybe been cooking eggs for 20 years for scrambled eggs, he might pick scrambled eggs recipe number 145. So in the story, the chef is making scrambled eggs, but the chef may include fancy ingredients, Himalayan sea salt, may include things like ground white pepper. Instead of scrambling the eggs or simply moving them around, he may be folding them gently to create a certain consistency and fluffiness in the eggs. He might use a certain kind of cream versus milk because it gives a different consistency. Now, to the chef, the complexity of the eggs and the decision-making process that he uses incorporates so many factors because he has expanded his understanding of the concept of scrambled eggs. Now, but to the patron, they may just simply be scrambled eggs. They might be the most delicious scrambled eggs they've ever had, but they cannot quite understand the complexity of them because they've not invested in the education to do that. So expanding or bringing that back to the idea of philosophy and ethics, when we start young, we understand things through the lenses that we have, and they're simple. And they use those lower parts of the human brain as part of the decision-making stack. And as we expand our awareness of ourselves and how we're connected to the community and connected to the rest of humanity, we start to understand that decisions aren't as simple as yes or no, good or bad, kill or not kill. That they incorporate a number of values and things that we would never have considered when we were children. A lot of times because our brain couldn't hold all that information. And only through experience do we gain the brain wrinkles that allow us to hold more and more data in our head. So optimally, what we really want to do is get ourselves to the point where we can understand the impacts our decisions have on humanity and on the planet and on the greater whole of our existence. That's tough. That's a tough order. And that's a lot of responsibility for us to deal with. Doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means it's a little bit more work. And as a community, a humanist community, or just humanity as a whole, we can work to try and make those general rules that we can follow that help us do it easier and more quickly, because we're always going to do that in our own minds. We're always going to make categories and heuristics that help us decide faster and better. But we also need that framework that helps us to second guess ourselves every once in a while to say, is this still the right category? Is this a good general rule to follow? Or do I need to rethink it? So if you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting, which is a fantastic movie, so if you've not seen it, I would recommend it. There's a point in the movie where Robin Williams' character, who is a therapist, is talking to, Will's character, Matt Damon's character, about the abuse that he suffered as a kid in the foster care system. And he keeps repeating to Will, the character Will, it's not your fault. And he keeps saying, yeah, I know. And he keeps saying, he's like, no, really, it's not your fault. He's like, yeah, I know. And he keeps repeating it to the point where Will's character first gets mad and then breaks down crying because he held, it seemed, an idea in his mind that somehow he deserved what had been given to him in terms of beating and abuse, because there must be some reason for it all. And I've seen this with people who use the categorical system, and a lot of times traditional religious systems. They think, well, this suffering must have a reason. Someone must have a plan for me. Why is it that someone in my life is suffering that I love? They've done nothing, it seems, to deserve it. And that's where we have had this cognitive dissonance in our lives. And so it's not that anyone is to blame or it's anyone's fault. And sometimes things happen, right? So there are reasons. It's not just like they happen for a reason, it's some reason out there. People get Alzheimer's because of, maybe it's the proteins that we found that have folded a certain way. Or maybe it's the plaque that develops in the brain. Or maybe it's other things that we haven't quite nailed down that cause those things that are biological processes. For cancer, it's the same thing. Cells mutate and metastasize until they take over parts of the body. So there's no particular reason for those things, they just happen. Now that doesn't mean they are meaningless, because the way I see it, those experiences help us to grow and understand things in the world. They help us understand loss, and loss helps us understand the value of human life, and it helps us value the time that we have while we're here. So it's not that they have inherent meaning, but they can have meaning based on what we use them for, what we learn from them. But I think that idea of it's not your fault doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to make good decisions. But what it does mean is that we all try and make the best decisions we can, given the information we have available to us and the energy that we have to make those decisions. If we're somewhere in our lives where, let's say that we knew better than to do something, but we didn't make that decision or didn't make the good decision because we were exhausted because of conditions of our family. Well, once the decision is made, look, you did the best you could given the circumstances. If you learn from it and you make a better decision in the future, then that's all anyone can ask. And so instead of being paralyzed by the options that are out there and the responsibility we have, I think it's important for us to make the best decision we can with the information we have, but then to cut ourselves a little bit of slack for decisions that didn't turn out quite as well as we had wished. Because really all you can do is accept it and move on. It's not like we can change the past. All we can do is learn from it. I've got a theory that an experience can only ever be a failure if you learn nothing from it. That to me is the only time an experience can be a failure. Otherwise, it was just a lesson. And it's important for us to do the same for others. Others make the same type of decisions with the best information that they have and the most energy they can muster at a given time. So if we give people a little bit of forgiveness, a little bit of grace, if you want to call it that, I think we all get along a little bit better and not attribute such hostile intent to people, such as on the road. So I hope this has been a useful reflection for you, because one of the ways we can build that system that allows us to second guess our categories or our quick rules of thumb is to sit back and reflect every once in a while. And so these Sunday services are a great way to do that. It's a little bit of time out of our day and out of our week where we sit back and think about whether it's a big idea or just think about how we're making decisions. Am I doing things the best way according to what I know? How do I reorient myself to maybe make better decisions or take better care of my family or take better care of my community? So with that, I thank you all for coming, and I welcome all of you out there who are watching to join us for these reflections, because I know it brings me value. Yes, I'm the one up here reading the points and talking about these topics, but I learn and grow every time I do this. And so I hope all of you who have come today have that same experience. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful week. For those of you at home, I would ask that you think about one thing that you were grateful for from the week, and think of one thing that you're looking forward to in the week to come. And we will do the same here. So thank you and have a great week.